The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and freedomslips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Cosmic Catastrophe on Revolution.radio. I am your host, Diamond, and joining us today is my lovely partner and co-host, Leah Shaper.
Hello.
We got a great show. It's like a double header. Excuse me. The first topic that just hit the headlines and the big question in the first half is going to be, is Elon Musk's Starlink mega constellation slowly poisoning Earth and potentially destroying our magnetosphere? According to a new paper, that's exactly what's happening.
Yes. I think that they might be blaming him a little bit unfairly, though. I think the rest of the space industry might be partially culpable in this.
I agree with you there. So we'll talk about the paper. We'll talk about the article. We'll talk about the facts at hand. We might even, I'm going to start with a little bit of climate fear before we get to the Elon Musk issue. And in the second half, we're going to tackle a very controversial topic, the Cerutti Mastadon site, which may show hominid presence in California 130,000 years ago. What was your final conclusion? Do you want to save it till the end?
I agree with their conclusion. I don't really see any reason to not go there. The folks that are detracting from that conclusion, I think their reasoning is kind of lame.
Yeah, I agree. All right, we're on the same page there. And finally, if we have time, the apocalypse has gone mainstream. So should be quite a fun show. If you're listening out there in Radio Land, support Revolution Radio, #1 listener-supported radio on the internet, and it supports free speech. Can you imagine that?
Yeah, it's great.
Can you see the screen?
I can.
Okay. Why are you laughing?
I got discombobulated there for a second because the next image of your screen, not your screen, your video that came up was mirror image, so it was messing with my brain.
Oh, weird. All right, so you just go to revolution.radio and you become a Patreon or give them a donation there. That's as simple as that.
What are the QR codes for?
For people that don't know how to go to websites, I guess, you just hold your phone up for Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Bitcoin Cash donations.
Ah.
So those are wallets.
Yeah.
Crypto. All right, let's start with a little bit of fear porn. It's not really that. It's fear mongering from the mainstream. I saw this headline and I was like, that can't be true. Summer heat hits Asia early, killing dozens, as one expert calls it the most extreme event in climate history.
I did actually see someone, I don't remember where, commenting somebody in South Asia talking about how insanely hot it's been there and that like you can't work during the day. It's just insane.
Well, some of these places average 110 to 120 degrees in the summer.
Right. But this person is somebody who lives there that was like, this is actually quite much hotter than what we're even used to.
Do you believe that, or do you believe it's part of the brainwashing where the people that believe in global warming think it's hotter than it's ever been too?
That could be the case as well, because I have also seen that from people who are kind of having their own internal hysteria about climate. And it's kind of bizarre to watch.
All right, so let's break this down. They're saying that dozens were killed, right? Mm-hmm. And that the temperature was up to 114.8 degrees. Mm. Now, when I saw that, I knew that it was a scam, and I'll show you why. In 1998, in India, it reached 49.5 C. That's 120. Mm-hmm. That's 6 degrees hotter.
Right.
And hundreds died. In Andhra, the heat wave in 2002, 49 C. Hundreds died there.
Yeah.
In 2015 stands as the deadliest. Thousands died.
Well,
and so they're claiming that dozens of deaths and 114 is some kind of is the greatest climate. What did they say? The most extreme event in climate history. Well, what about these events that are more extreme?
Right. Right.
In early summer of 2022, India hit its hottest March in 122 years. What about that day?
It's weird how, I mean, despite the fact that as human beings, we have all lived through heat waves. You know, some of us have lived through heat waves that are more extreme than others, but we've all lived through this. And yet, articles like this are able to convince people that it's more extreme than anything that they've ever experienced. Somehow our own personal experience just disappears from our memories. It's very bizarre.
Yeah, it's like everything with this narrative has become the most extreme. Everything, just like everything, climate change causes everything.
Yeah.
Everything is the most extreme it's ever been.
Yeah.
Which, if you go look, like we just did, is
not
unfortunately not the fact. It just started raining incredibly here.
I don't have any rain over here 2 miles down the road. Not yet, but it is kind of windy.
All right, let's dive into the first half main topic here. This controversial paper claims that satellite mega constellation like SpaceX's could weaken Earth's magnetic field and cause something called atmospheric stripping, which is what happened to Mars, why it has no atmosphere.
Mm-hmm.
And the question is, should we be worried? I think we should be, but there's a lot of other things to be worried about.
Yeah.
Okay, so this new paper argues that atmospheric metal pollution from falling space junk could create an invisible conductive shield around our planet that might weaken our magnetosphere. However, other experts are skeptical, which when it comes to any new controversial idea, you are going to have people on one side and people on completely the opposite side. And we'll see that with the Cerutti Mastadon in about a half an hour.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But, you know, thankfully we have skeptics, right? This is part of what makes science interesting and how we get to good conclusions is with skepticism.
Now, the interesting thing, and let's show this jiffy. This is literally what we're talking about. This is actual imagery of a re-entering satellite melting.
How did they get this footage?
With another satellite next to it with a camera.
Yeah, but isn't the other satellite next to it also?
No, not if it's protected. Not if it's meant to re-enter and take a picture.
Yeah, okay. All right.
And this also could be shot from far away from a satellite that's like a telescope, you know, looking at it 10,000 miles away.
Right, right, right.
But it is pretty high resolution and crazy.
Yeah, that's really crazy.
The way you see the main central, whatever this is, aluminum, the metal shaft slowly degrading.
Yeah.
And so these parts, you can see the little shards flying off there.
Yeah.
So thousands of these are re-entering every year, apparently.
Yeah, and the amount of material re-entering every day is 29 tons. That's just space Starlink.
Just Starlink junk.
Yeah.
The amount, so let's repeat that for the people listening. The amount of Starlink debris from Elon Musk's arrays is dumping how many tons? 29 tons a day?
29 tons. And so that's like one. Wait a minute. Is it happening now or is that? So that's the estimate for one mega constellation.
Okay.
Of which there will be many, right? So a mega constellation is about 42,000 satellites. And 29 tons out of those 42,000 satellites of material would enter every day for one mega constellation.
So to be clear, Elon Musk isn't at that level. He's got just how many?
It's like 5,500 satellites that are up right now.
And there is a good portion of them that are dead, that are just up there that are going to re-enter. I think it's 40 or 50 right now.
Right, and they're planned to do that, right? They're not permanent. They're supposed to last about 5 years, but there are also some that have failed prematurely.
Right. So to get to the bottom, not only are there failed satellites up there right now that will re-enter, every single working satellite only has a working life of 5 years.
Right.
So it's literally creating the most space junk ever conceived ever in history.
Right. Well,
and
go ahead.
I was going to say the problem is no one has ever really considered the effects of putting 29 tons of metallic particulates up in the ionosphere.
Right.
What could go wrong?
Well, and for a little bit of contextual perspective too, this paper contains an estimate that since the beginning of the space industry, okay, so since the 60s, there's been approximately 20,000 tons of material that's been demolished in the atmosphere in reentry. 20,000 tons.
Yeah, and that will only exponentially increase.
Right. Yeah, so surely like a huge majority of that has probably been in the last couple of decades, you know. But with Starlink, that's going to increase exponentially.
Well, and with all spacecraft, it says here in this paper, potential perturbation of the ionosphere by megaconstellations and corresponding artificial reentry plasma dust, that 500,000 to 1 million satellites are expected in the next few decades.
Right.
So how many megaconstellations is that?
It's that divided by 42,000. It's 42,000 satellites per constellation. So what is that? That's I'm not good at doing math off the top of my head. You are.
Well, if it's a million, it's 20. It would be how many are there? 40? How many thousand?
42,000 satellites per constellation, and we're looking at potentially 500,000 to 1 million satellites total.
So 200 megaconstellations times 29 tons is it's ridiculous.
Yeah, it's a huge amount of material. And it's, again, it's would be constantly recycling, because you're always going to have these satellites whose working life is over and they re-enter and then you put new ones up. So it's not like once it's up there, it's done. You're continuing to add material all the time.
Yeah. So what is happening is that these particles are not really in the atmosphere where our weather is. They're way up in the upper ionosphere. Mm-hmm. But they've done some calculations, which are fantastic. The weight of the metal dust up there is already multiple times heavier than the entire Van Allen belts.
Yeah, like what was the estimation they get? Like 100 million. No, here it is. 100 billion times greater than the Van Allen belts. That's the 20,000 tons that we already know are up there.
Yeah. So, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, in one respect, I find it a little bit funny that we have people like, Bill Gates, who are proposing that we inject like salt particles into the atmosphere to block out the sun. I think you could probably argue you could work with this material for such a function, and either way, it's totally crazy. I think the real problem is that we really don't know what the effect of this will be upon our magnetosphere. And I also think it's problematic that there's probably no way for us to untangle the effect of this material on our magnetosphere from the effect of the sun on the magnetosphere, right? So we already have a waning magnetosphere because of low solar activity. How do we untangle those two issues in terms of their effect?
Yeah, and I wonder if these new types of aurora, like Steve and the other types of new aurora, have something to do with this abundance of metal particulates up in the ionosphere where this is occurring.
Yeah, I mean, that's quite possible. And how do we untangle that?
And the bad news is we currently have no way of monitoring the amount of space dust in the atmosphere.
Right. Yeah.
But based on the amount of space junk that is already burned up on reentry, we could have increased the amount of metallic particulates in the skies 1,000,000-fold since the start of the space age.
Right. So like in one respect, that actually makes me slightly optimistic, right? Because we've put a ton of more than many tons of material up there, excuse the pun. And as far as we know, it hasn't had any like tremendously detrimental effect on our magnetosphere. I mean, yes, the magnetosphere has weakened by what, like 10, 15%. But yeah, I don't know.
What they're proposing here is crazy. Okay, let's go over it. If all these proposed satellites go up in flames and melt, the resulting amount of metallic dust could create a perfect conductive net around the planet. It could be capable of carrying an electric charge. We know that's true. There is lots of electricity flowing in the ionosphere. And if this happened, the magnetosphere, which normally extends thousands of miles into space, could be distorted to stay under the conducting material. Think about that.
Right.
Our magnetosphere would only extend to the end of the ionosphere.
Right.
The amount of cosmic radiation that entered Earth, it would be a mass extinction.
Right. Well, and then, on a shorter time frame in terms of issues, like you also have the potential for more electric interaction between, let's say, satellites because of the increased current.
Yeah. And if there was a solar storm and the magnetosphere only went to the edge of the ionosphere, I don't know what that would even mean. The end of the Earth?
Right. Right. Well, and there's another interesting, is it in this paper? Yeah, this paper also touches on, you brought up Mars earlier. So it sort of touches on the idea that part of the reason why Mars may not have an atmosphere might be because of planetary material that was distributed into the atmosphere, right? So like, I'm assuming they're sort of talking about like a plasma discharge event that blows a bunch of planetary material into space.
Or massive impacts, a series of them.
Right. It could be also a bunch of massive impacts. They could be thinking about it that way also. But they're sort of hypothesizing here that may have played a role in the blowing away of Mars's atmosphere. Right. So that's potentially a danger for Earth as well. Because we are literally taking tons of material from Earth and putting it up in the atmosphere.
Right. And as it increases exponentially over the next decade or so, even if the magnetosphere doesn't shrink, the increased levels of spacecraft dust could still make it harder for rockets to launch new satellites and other spacecraft into space. And this is because the magnetic particles would be supercharged and could interfere with onboard electronics. Yeah.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
Well, just something else for context in thinking about this. There is a lot of material there as well from meteors being destroyed on reentry, right? So that's about 50 tons of meteorite material every day. So that's also really significant. And like that, again, kind of makes me feel slightly optimistic because that's also quite a lot of material. Regardless, Starlink is like 3 times as much as that meteorite material.
Yeah, so if we're doubling or tripling it in the near future, we don't know what those effects would be.
Right.
Okay, and in Salter Hunt's worst case scenario, the author of the paper, increased levels of radiation bombardment in the upper ionosphere, which I just discussed, kind of like increased cosmic rays, could begin to blow away the outer edges of the ionosphere. And this is what is known as atmospheric stripping, which you alluded to, what happened to Mars and maybe even Mercury.
Right.
Yeah. Right. But this is the most extreme case and would take centuries, if not millennia, to occur.
Right.
Which is still not a good thing.
Right.
All right, we're just going to all die in 9,000 years.
Yeah. Something else that kind of freaked me out a little bit. So I was looking at the Wikipedia entry for the Van Allen belts, and there's a part of the entry that talks about how certain people have proposed this idea of like removing the Van Allen belts. And I think what they mean by that is actually removing all of the electrons and protons that get trapped in there. Like I don't know if you can. I don't know that you could remove the belt itself, right? Because you're talking about like a magnetic field, basically. I don't know that you can remove that.
I
So I
mean,
think
you would create a planet-size electromagnet or something like that, maybe.
yeah. Well, anyway, I think it's really about removing the actual particles that are trapped in the Van Allen belts. In
Some
order
kind of
to
big
make
particle vacuum.
right, but in order to reduce the issues that are incurred by satellites going through the Van Allen belts and spacecraft, etc. So then it made me think like, man, I can totally see with this particular issue with all the space junk and the space the material, all the particles of the space junk material is somebody going to propose that so that we can continue launching satellites, but then we just start removing material from the Van Allen belts? And I don't know, that just was like, I don't think we should screw with that. That doesn't
And the
seem
whole
like a good
idea of a catastrophe in low Earth orbit due to a cascading failure of space junk and satellites is inevitable if we think we're going to launch 1 million satellites in the next 10 years into space.
Right.
Imagine the air traffic control needed for that.
Right.
We don't even have good air traffic control on the surface. We're talking about an area that's probably 100 times more vast.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so bad things, we are just a really dumb species that continues to pollute ever more as if there is no end game.
Yeah.
The end game is a catastrophe, and it always is. Empires always fail.
I mean, I kind of cross my fingers that the empire ends before we get to like a critical mass with these kinds of issues. I suspect that that's probably likely.
Yeah, because if all of the satellites re-enter at once, how many tons is that? And what does that do?
Right. Well, and then it's like you have to think too about, with all of that material, are we then creating something like a massive volcanic eruption, that blocks out the sun for a while and causes all kinds of biological chaos on Earth?
You mean, is it going to be the equivalent of?
Right.
Yeah. No, I think the biggest problem is that all of this is just not inert metal up there. It's toxic. There's toxic stuff up here.
Right.
And all of this accumulates.
And it's conductive.
And in the ionosphere, at some point, it mixes into the stratosphere and then comes back down to the surface.
Right.
And so all the people that think chemtrails have barium and aluminum, it's probably, in the rain. I mean, all the rain contains PFAS. It's got now has forever chemicals. It also has metals, which is why it's toxic to drink rain in most places without filtering it. Can you imagine how toxic the rain will be for future generations?
Right.
Disgusting.
Yep.
We need to study this now. And I think there's probably lobbying groups that are probably just preventing it from happening because they need to launch 1 million more satellites.
The other thing that's interesting is this paper talks about how, I can't remember which part of it, but studying a portion of this would actually take decades, and I'm not really clear on why that is. So they're kind of having a hard time like making good estimates about all of this. I'm trying to find the reference to that. I don't see it now.
Well, I think you'd have to go up there and set up a baseline for the amount of space dust that's up in the ionosphere in different levels. They don't have that. There's no way to monitor it. And then you'd have to monitor it for at least a decade to see if it shifts.
Yeah. So we're really like relying on like models here to sort of take a guess.
I mean, know how good those are.
Yeah. I don't know. I think no matter how you look at it, though, just with the amount of material that we are putting up there, that inherently has to come down again, like that alone, I think points to clearly there is some big problem here, regardless of the I think the magnitude is going to be quite large, regardless of how specific the estimates are.
Yeah, let's just pray for no atmospheric stripping. All right, let's switch topics because we got a lot to discuss here with the Cerutti Mastadon site. If you don't know about the Cerutti Mastadon site, it's a paleontological and possible archaeological. Based on all of the study I've done, I'm going to say 100% archaeological, especially after the 2020 paper that I sent you right before the show. Did you look at it?
I just got a chance to read the abstract.
All right, we'll talk about that at the end. So what happened in 2017, they're building a highway in south of San Diego, and researchers announced that broken mastodon bones at the site were found and then subsequently dated to 130,700 years ago.
Pretty amazing.
The mind-blowing thing is that as they studied and they spent a very long time at the site, it started to become apparent that it looked like an assemblage of broken bones and cobbles, not a paleontological site. Yeah. Because a typical paleontological site, you would find an entire skeleton of something. And here they're finding partial skeletons, missing bones, and what it clearly appears to be broken up bones that as you get closer to the cobbles are smaller pieces. It's so
right.
When you look at the final excavation and the survey they did, it clearly looks like someone was sitting there near the cobble smashing these bones.
Right.
And more importantly, when they came out with this and that date came out, of course they got attacked. Yeah. Because we've got the problem with changing the paradigm.
Yeah. I want to point out too, for all of the folks that take issue with carbon dating, that this wasn't done with carbon dating. It was done with uranium thorium dating.
Yeah. Now what happens with that? This is a specific type of dating that can be used for the last, let's say, about 500,000 years. So each dating technique has a range. Uranium-235 is a perfect clock, and it slowly decays to thorium-230. And this is often called thorium-230 dating as well. It's so specific that you get a very accurate date. And then when you redate it, they typically match up very close. And so when the date of 130 came out, it was very hard to deny it.
Right.
The problem with that
it's just the question of, you can only debate it on the level of, are these bones fractured by humans or by some natural process? That's the only way you can argue about this.
Right. And the counter argument on the natural processes we'll get into, they don't hold water to me as a stratigrapher. They made up scenarios that could have happened, but when you look at the paleontology and the stratigraphy here, that didn't happen.
Yeah.
They claim that these rocks could have been transported by water. The only problem is there's no other rocks in the area.
Right.
One of the cobbles that was found in the assemblage weighed 30 pounds.
Yeah.
You would literally need a substantial flood of tens of thousands of CFS to move that. And there is no evidence of any of that happening here at the site. You certainly wouldn't get bones sitting together in a nice pile here.
Yeah.
Those would have all been washed away.
Right. They also propose that the work that they were doing in the area was creating pressure and pushing down on all of this stuff, and that it was some human induced in some other way, inadvertently, but that doesn't make sense either based on the other paper that you sent me and something that's been pointed out since, but we'll get to that.
Well, a bunch has been done, physical science, observational physical science, to prove that these assemblages are potentially made by humans. Yeah. Now, the first thing was lithics experts on bones went in and looked at what they had here, and they concluded that the bones were shattered when they were fresh.
Yes, that too.
So that is the first line of evidence that experts came in and said that these fragments, which you're looking at here on the screen, if you rewatch tonight on Magnetic Reversal News, 8 p.m. Mountain Time. And so what they found were bone fragments, and so the lithic experts also found that the shape and style of the shards of bone can only be produced by smashing it with a cobble.
Right. Right. So
There
it's
are
like
no natural processes that produce these flakes.
right. The pattern of breakage provides that information, as well as the fact that the bones had to have been fresh at the time that they were broken.
Yeah. So right there should shut down some of the skeptics.
Yeah.
But they didn't stop, and they published a paper coming up with all the cockamamie sedimentary schemes that could have created this.
Right. Well, and as the original researchers pointed out, they were like, everybody who's making these criticisms is making the criticisms from afar. Like, you actually need to come here and examine the bones before you come to that conclusion. Like, that lithics work is extremely important here.
Well, more importantly, of the videos I watched of the excavation show the bones in situ. They were not crushed from above, right next to cobbles that were undisturbed.
Right.
They literally had to go down feet of silt to expose all of these things. So getting back to the fact that the fragments, the bone fragments, the broken ones, were broken when they were fresh, means that they could have been broken by a catastrophe, a landslide.
Sure.
But there is no evidence of that. There's a few cobbles, and the cobbles are the absolute smoking gun. So what they found on the cobbles were linear abrasion patterns, which were only typical of striking a cobble against a surface to create these. And what I mean by that is that they found only on a single side of all of these cobbles, these marks, as if someone was using it as a tool and it had a proper position to be held, and it was only being used on that side. And that was the initially what they found, simply these grooves. And then they got a bunch of experts in on here, and they determined that there were no natural forces on Earth that could produce these except a human smashing it onto the ground or into a rock or onto a bone.
And it's repeated. It's not like it can't be like a stone falling off of a cliff and happening to hit one of these bones. It's repeated striking.
And interestingly enough, when you look at the grooves, there is a unidirectional pattern, meaning they were being used only in one direction. And so skeptics come out and say, blah, 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 that could have been rolled around in a creek. But so they studied the stones, and guess what they found on them?
Oh, they found microscopic bone particles, but not, not over the whole stone, only on one side, right? So
where
it's not
the grooves are.
Right. It's not some passive transfer of the bone particles to the cobbles. It's quite intentional.
Yeah, and here's the paper. Raman and optical microscopy of bone microresidues on cobbles from the Cerutti Mastadon site. Evidence that support human agency on bone and stone artifacts from the Cerutti Mastadon site. So the cobbles from this site have impact marks and use wear suggesting that mastodon bones were placed on stone anvils and struck with stone hammers to produce two concentrations of broken bones and stones. Now, critics have suggested that these stones may have broken by rolling down the slope. And as they rolled down, they hit the bone and got just a little bit of bone on one side. What do you think about that?
I think that's pretty silly, especially if you find the same repeated pattern amongst the cobbles.
Yeah, here's the giant cobble. Here's the array of bones. I need the paper. And there's more interesting things we're going to get to about this site. We're going to cover it completely. So the assemblages are so obviously, let's see if we can get this bigger. Assemblages. And what I mean by that is that if you go, there's two circular assemblages here and a third one. That if this is a circular array of lithics and you see how they peter out, there's no more. And then another concentration with the bigger bones towards the center and cobbles in the middle of the arrays. It's clear as if there was a group, one guy over here doing the bashing and another guy sitting here bashing them up.
It's like a processing center.
Right. And their argument that this isn't done by humans is there's no human bones here.
Well, they also made the argument that
Wait a minute. Let's talk about that. Why would there be human bones at a bone processing area?
right,
There's
unless they were
live people
cannibals.
here processing bones, not dead people.
Right. And we're not claiming they were cannibals. So
No. In fact, the assemblage shows they were eating everything. Dire wolf, mastodon. There's a bunch of animals.
I was about to ask you about that because I knew about the other animal remnants, but I didn't know where they were in relation to the mastodon. So I was wondering if it was, a big processing center of all kinds of animals, or if they were found somewhere else.
No, they're all the bones. All these specks is what you're looking at, and the bones are all the blue specks.
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the other objections was that there were no like stone flakes found, and they're like, "Well, there's no stone flakes here, so this wasn't a human site." And it's like, well, why did is there some like thing where all humans had to have been flaking stone? I mean, maybe these people were not.
Well, they could have been. Listen, this is 130,000 years ago. There's evidence, there's primitive flaking, there's primitive knives. There's no real arrowheads, just flakes from flint and stuff, but clearly tools. Some of them are napped, but this site is not a meat processing site. This site is a marrow processing site.
Yeah.
They're bringing the bones later on, and they don't need knives here.
Right.
There's no meat. It's a bone. They literally need anvils and hammers. They need one giant rock tied to a stick and another rock on the ground. And that's what they found here.
Yeah. I mean, I bet you anything that not that far away, you could find another site that has
Mythics.
Right.
Yeah.
And the other thing that's interesting about this is like, okay, we credit Henry Ford with the invention of the like assembly line technique, but that's exactly what you have here, right? You've got like somewhere else, you've got the meat processing going on, and then over here you've got the bone processing site, and it's broken down into stages, right? You've got the breaking down the larger bones over here, and then the smaller bones over here. It's like we've been doing assembly line work.
Site where they're processing the hides.
Yep.
For clothing.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's a pretty like natural human way of doing things.
Yeah. And how you would naturally get something that's called an assemblage in nature like this, it's a highly suspect.
Right.
All right. There was many animals at the Cerutti site, including teeth and molars. But one of the fascinating things, another piece of evidence that somebody did something here, is that there was this mastodon tusk. And here we can see the stratigraphy of the site. You have a blue layer, you have a sandy silt layer, you have a finer silt layer, you have a major boundary, and a completely different layer underneath. So 4 stratigraphic layers, and this tusk appears to be shoved through and into the bottom layer. As if on purpose. The odds of getting a tusk in a vertical position in a stratigraphy is 0.
Right, because what's going to hold it up?
No, someone pushed this
what I'm saying is
the ground.
If it were to just naturally land on the ground, there's nothing to hold it up there. Like this.
Sitting there for 1,000 years as the silt accumulated.
Right.
No, the evidence is that someone or something pushed this into the ground. Because I think the top of it was being used as a platform for bashing.
Or it could have been
something
like,
else, or doing some other.
Maybe it was the support arm for like, I don't know, a tent, with animal hide or something like that. Like, who knows?
It was definitely there doing something.
Right.
And it's fascinating.
Yeah.
So the naysayers have very little to say about that. So the Cerutti site appears to show someone or something processing these bones. So now we have to consider what was going on. This is 130,000 years ago. Is it possible that there were humans in North America 130,000 years ago? Was it possible that it was a different type of hominin, Denisovan, Homo erectus? A lost species? This could be a lost hominid. We don't know yet.
Sure.
Because we know how rare it is to find hominin bones.
Yeah. Well, I was about to say, and as you and I know and have talked about many times, I mean, we believe there's no reason to think that there weren't hominids in North America, really at any point that hominids have been around.
Yeah, and the evidence is piling up.
Yeah.
Just in our lifetime, we've gone from. So in early academia, for me, it was Clovis first.
Mhm.
The only problem with that is, in knowing Dennis Stanford from the Smithsonian, he had accumulated hundreds of thousands of Cerutti artifacts by the early 1990s. The Cerutti are pre-Clovis.
Yeah.
Yet in academia, there was no acknowledgement of humans being here in North America prior to 13,900 years ago.
Right.
It was
It's
not
like
allowed.
Everybody's stuck on the land bridge idea that, we only got here, like at most 26,000 years ago.
And so Clovis first lasted a while. It's still taught, and most people think that humans only got here 14,000 years ago.
Yeah.
The problem is we've known Cerutti assemblages that these are assemblages of larger axe heads, big. These are big projectile points and axe heads from the Cerutti race or culture that are underneath Clovis.
Yeah.
They're found in caves all over North America, East Coast, West Coast, Central. And yet we are still not teaching Cerutti. Yet we've confirmed 23,000-year-old footprints in white sands.
Right. But we're still pretending that we weren't here. It's like, come
so
on.
We've got all these artifacts from the people who left the footprints, but they didn't get here for 10,000 until 10,000 years later.
Right.
That is the state of science. And now we've got this obvious assemblage of someone sitting here processing bones. And they're like, well, there's no bones, so people couldn't have done it.
Yeah.
No human bones, so they didn't do it.
Yeah.
There's no arrowheads. I'm like, this is 130,000 years ago. This is a primitive processing site.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's also cool to think about just from the perspective of why you would be processing all of these bones, right? Which would be to get to the marrow that's in the bones, which is highly, highly, highly nutritious.
Which is going to make our brains grow and make us smarter and smarter.
Right, right. And so just having a site dedicated to this just shows you that whoever these hominids were, they clearly knew how important it was for them to get that marrow.
Yeah, and so the anti-paper, the rebuttal that came out, had a bunch of people that were against it. And their basic only conclusion is that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So they wanted a written note there from these people that they were there.
Right. And that's like where that argument came from. Like, oh, well, where are the stone flakes? So there's no stone flakes, so you can't make that conclusion, which on its face is just silly. Like there could be a million reasons why, and we already talked about this, why there's no stone flakes here. But like, you're by saying that you're assuming that humans have always flaked stones, and that's not necessarily the case. Like, why would you make that assumption?
Well, the one argument is that 130,000 years ago, almost every culture was using spears, and we didn't find any. I'm like, this is a bone processing, this is not a hunting ground.
Yeah.
You don't
like
bring your spears to a marrow processing plant.
Right. What's their purpose there, right? And like I said earlier, I bet you anything, if you excavated within, 5 miles or something, you're going to find another site that has stone flakes and maybe spears.
Yeah, I would think there's a village nearby, a processing plant.
Right.
Because they're going to have so much food that a bunch of people can live nearby.
Well, so that's the other interesting thing about this again, right? Like, because it's being processed in this way, like we're assuming there's a meat processing site somewhere nearby. And then you've got the bone/marrow processing site. And then that to me suggests that these people, they're not just eating the marrow as they get to it. They're probably collecting it and storing it somehow for the community. Otherwise, why would you process it this way?
Yeah, bring it all back for a feast that night.
Right. Because you're going to have a huge quantity of marrow at this point.
Yeah. And so another problem that the skeptics have is that it's that old. It's that there's no note left by the people and that it's too old because we all know that we just got here,
right?
13,000 years ago. So this is impossible.
Another reminder that you have to be led by evidence first and not by your assumptions.
Yeah. And so the follow-up paper in 2020, I love it. Saskatoon boards where they found bone residue in those grooves, proving that someone or something was using these cobbles to smash the bones.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there is a counter argument that a giant monkey did this. The only problem with that is that there's no giant monkey in North America 130,000 years ago. That stood for years, the giant monkey theory.
It's embarrassing.
Giant monkeys don't make lithics or carry spears, but they do bash bones, apparently.
Okay, fine. But, again, then you need evidence of monkeys in North America. So.
Well, they didn't even look into the paleontology. There's no such thing as a marrow-eating monkey.
Yeah, well, that's why I say it's just freaking embarrassing. Because yet again,
fruits and ants.
Right. I mean, yet again, you can just easily do some quick checking of your information to show that can't be correct.
The elusive marrow-eating monkey, clearly that pushes tusks into the ground.
I mean, talk about like not obeying the law. Well, it's not a law, but not abiding by Occam's razor, right? Like these people resist this conclusion so strongly that they have to make up a marrow-eating monkey in North America to explain their counter argument. I mean, that's absurd.
Well, there were no people here. There had to be marrow-eating monkeys.
Well, they should abide by their own advice. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, so they better provide some extraordinary evidence for this marrow-eating monkey.
I have some extraordinary evidence to share as we get to the end of the show. We're looking at the Epica ice core data, which goes back here almost 1 million years, showing all of the large ice age cycles and the massive temperature fluxes on Earth. And what we have here is current time all the way here on the right. So this is 0 time. This is our interstadial. This is our warm time. The curious thing is that this site where humans were in North America dates to the peak of the Eemian warm, which would be the highest sea level on Earth in the last several million years. Almost no ice anywhere, and easy for hominids to travel from anywhere on Earth to walk here potentially or boat across the Bering Bridge. It was warm. So it was very hospitable, and this could have been a time of great migration for the entire planet. And I think that a lot of the hominins moved around 130,000 years ago, spreading out over the entire world. And this could have been one of the first population explosions. Now, clearly, there's many other interstadials.
Yeah.
But we really don't see Homo sapiens coming into their own really in great force until 150,000 years ago, which is right before the Eemian warm, where we might have started eating that marrow and exploded across planet Earth.
Yeah.
Cro-Magnon is born during the Eemian.
Interesting.
Yeah. And it is the warmest time on planet Earth, much warmer. And not to blow your minds, global warmists, it could be up to 5 degrees warmer than it is today back in the Eemian warm.
Yeah. Well, and as we know, like civilizations tend to flourish when it's warm. It's why we had the Minoan warm period and the Roman warm period. Civilizations do well when it's warm.
Yeah, interesting. What's a little weird is that we're also here in North America, here at the coldest point in the last 2 million years, 22,000 years ago, walking around barefoot in New Mexico.
Yeah.
It wasn't that cold in New Mexico during the maximum maximum glaciation 22,000 years ago, let's say.
Right.
It wasn't always cold in New Mexico. It had seasons.
Yeah, sure.
And in fact, it was based on this 8, 10, 12 degrees C colder, which means instead of it being 110 in the summer, it was 80. So it was awesome there.
Yeah.
That's why they were there.
Yeah.
Yep.
And the other thing that's very cool about this graph is you can see that there's an obvious shift in the pattern, right? Right about 420,000 years ago, the peaks become larger and more severe.
Yeah, it goes from a 41,000 year cycle to a 104,000 year cycle.
Right. And this is like the giant question of the day for us, right? What made this pattern change? Something happened. Something major happened.
Yes. Will we ever know?
No.
All right. We'll link you below to your uranium thorium dating as well, so you can get up to speed on that and how they did the dating. And we got a few minutes left to talk about the apocalypse going mainstream. Now, the end of the world is becoming normal conversation thanks to AI. And fears of AI are not the only things driving public concern about the end of the world. The media, climate change, pandemics, and this whole cult of fear is really, children today, Gen Z, and what's the one before them? Do we have that one yet?
I think I don't remember. I want to say it's called like Gen Alpha or something like that, but I don't remember. There is a name.
They're doomed because they now have genetic climate fear built into their body.
Well, the Gen Z kids do too. I mean, those are the kids who are like in college saying, well, the world's going to end in 7 years. Then it's like, well, why are you in college then? Like, what are you doing here?
Exactly. The most dire predictions claim that machines will take over within 5 to 10 years. The singularity is occurring in less than 6 years. So I'm going with the lower end, when AI becomes sentient and now we're fighting off little mechanical dogs.
Right. We'll be over here living as if it's like, the 19th century or the 18th century.
Well, that's why I got extra shotgun shells, because I think those will be the most important against robots and flying drones.
Right.
It'll be like Terminator Skeet version.
Yeah. You know what's real funny about, I think it's this article on this topic, is that they reference another quote unquote study that was done, which I went and took a brief look at. And that study claims that media simply reflects public opinion, that it's not so much influencing public opinion, that it is just reflecting it, which in our experience, especially in recent history, I think we could easily argue is absolutely not the case, because it's pretty obvious that the media is trying very hard to drive a narrative into people's heads in various ways.
It can't become clear to you until you get older, and if you had been looking at this. So for you and I, we've been looking at this for decades, and we see I think it's the definition of red pill. When you see through the veil, the Maya, and you can see the manipulation began when you were a child and continues till today, the same manipulation, there is zero chance that the media reflects public sentiment. It is the exact opposite.
Well, there's a couple of, and again, I only took a really cursory look at this study, and there's a couple of problems. One, they kind of lump together public opinion and government policy, which, I mean, you have to separate those two things, right? It doesn't make any sense. But then also a lot of the sources that they're referencing for their theories are from other papers that were written, many of them, earlier than 2015, even back into the 90s. And I think you could probably make the argument that media was less influential over public opinion in prior decades. But it's a little hard to know, because it's hard to be objective about this. Like what you were saying in terms of being red pilled, you have to you had to have had a period in your life where, you know, you're kind of vaguely listening to corporate media, and then start looking into independent media and seeing the stark difference in conclusions and opinions and narratives that are occurring, and stark differences in the truths, the quote unquote truths that are being told, in order to see what kind of manipulation is actually happening, you know? So it's like, without having done that comparison, you're not going to see it. You know, I'd say that the large majority of our viewers do see it, and that's why they watched our channel, you know?
Exactly.
But if you haven't
look
done
at
any of that, you're not going to see it.
you listen to some of this independent journalisms, these journalists or scientists or podcasters, and they're saying the complete opposite of what the mainstream media is saying. And that's when people are like, wait a minute, how can that be? And then you actually do something about it. You look into it and you're like, wait a minute.
Yeah. Right.
Wait a minute.
You know, like, I have this ongoing argument with my father about the amount of censorship that's actually going on in the world. And, you know, in his view, it's like the same as it's always been. And I'm like, no freaking way. You know, the last like decade has been infinitely worse than it ever was. But that's because he doesn't look at independent media.
The apocalypse is coming. Revolution Radio, the #1 listener supported radio on the internet. Become a Patreon. Support me.
Listen to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.
Hello, my name is Mr.